folks, everybody amazing. Today, we're going to be talking about something that is frankly completely unsurprising to anyone who has been paying attention. I'm talking about the CAGOP owning itself. Another, oops, I did it again, as always. Unfortunately, the leadership of my party that I'm a part of here in California is not only feckless, but remarkably incompetent. And I bring these stories to your attention because we are in the middle of a realignment inside the Republican Party here in California, and it's important to note these things. There is an ongoing battle between the consulting class and grassroots America First voters, candidates and activists, and it's good to see who's who and what's what. Now, that said, what we're watching play out in real time is the old guard trying to maintain control of the party. They have repeatedly failed to grow, repeatedly failed to modernize, and repeatedly failed to win with. And in the process, they continue making self-destructive decisions that alienate some of the most energized portions of the Republican base. Now, to understand what's happening now, we need to go back to February. Earlier this year, we covered how both the LA GOP and the CAGOP began escalating attacks against myself and other America First candidates. They began openly fear-mongering about what they described as an America First takeover of the Republican Party. See, in a February 19th memo circulated throughout party circles as well as online, the CAGOP described what they called the radical and divisive iteration of America First ideology as being directly at odds with the core founding principles of the United States Constitution, followed by the usual barrage of accusations and melodramatic language. It read less like a serious political strategy document and more like something written by a failed Days of Our Lives screenwriter. But beyond the tone itself, it became very clear what the actual purpose of the memo was. As you continue to read it, the CAGOP specifically began targeting what they referred to as the Groyper movement. They explicitly referenced Nick Fuentes, claimed versions of America First politics were incompatible with the Republican Party, compared elements of the movement with Nazi Germany, and repeatedly framed it as white nationalist or extremist. In reality, what the memo was doing was creating a political litmus test. It was an attempt to isolate, pressure, and potentially push out candidates and activists who were unwilling to fully conform to the consultant-driven structure of the party apparatus here in California. And that pressure campaign was very real. Going into the convention, there were widespread rumors that I, along with several other candidates, were going to be censured or targeted through resolutions designed to isolate us politically. I discussed this on my social media at the time. I also exposed how they failed at passing those resolutions. And now, to be fair, the fear campaign did work on some folks. Some candidates folded completely. Some chose to bend the knee to the consultant class because they were afraid of losing support or access within the party infrastructure. But there were also a number of us who stood firm. Needless to say, our presence at the convention was significant and felt. We were walking around 30 deep, highly organized, highly visible, and impossible to ignore. This was documented publicly, including in a recent interview I did with Anthony Cabasa, where we discussed the effect our movement had on the convention atmosphere itself. All that said, what the establishment thought was going to be a quiet suppression campaign instead became a very public demonstration that there is a large and growing grassroots movement inside the Republican Party that is no longer willing to simply sit quietly and follow orders from consultants and party operatives. Now, needless to say, from the beginning, I said the strategy from the CAGOP was going to backfire. And it already has, because the reality is that America First is not some fringe slogan invented yesterday. It is one of the oldest political slogans in modern American politics. Pat Buchanan used it. Donald Trump borrowed it back in 2015. And yes, it has also been associated with Nick Fuentes and younger online activists in the dissident right online. And that's precisely the problem with what the CAGOP attempted to do. They tried to treat a broad political sentiment as though it belonged exclusively to one faction they dislike. In doing so, they ended up alienating younger activists, grassroots organizers, and many of the very people most energized about the future of the GOP. And the irony became even more obvious when President Trump himself continued to publicly use the phrase America First while discussing his economic and foreign policy agenda just weeks after the CAGOP attempted and failed to purge the party of the America First folks. So needless to say, their entire strategy immediately began collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions. What the CAGOP was really attempting to do in broad daylight was to cull the herd. They wanted to separate the weakest and most compliant people from those unwilling to toe the line. But historically, the Republican Party has never been strongest when it was controlled by cautious consultants and gatekeepers. The Republican Party has historically been strongest when it embraced outsiders. Abraham Lincoln was an outsider. Theodore Roosevelt, an outsider. Donald Trump, an outsider. The party traditionally rewarded people willing to challenge stale institutional thinking and stand on principle rather than simply go along to get along. One of the greatest diseases of modern corporate politics is that too many politicians are motivated primarily by self-preservation, consultant approval, donor networks, or career advancement rather than actual conviction. Thankfully, there are still many people inside the party willing to challenge that culture and take the hits to do it. And over time, through observable reality and sheer irony, the CAGOP continues proving that this memo was an extraordinarily foolish political calculation on their part. Because shortly after the CAGOP made their circus live, everything imploded in their face. As soon as an April 6th article in the New Yorker by Antonia Hitchens, which included yours truly, cited polling and reporting showing that roughly 75% of younger Republican infrastructure figures identified with or aligned themselves with what the CAGOP broadly branded as America First ideology. That number is important because it directly contradicted the premise of the memo itself. The majority of younger Republican activists, organizers, and highly engaged political participants were aligning with some version of America First politics. In other words, the CAGOP essentially declared war on a significant portion of the future base of the Republican Party. And needless to say, things only became worse for them from there. See, on May 21st, the Public Sentiment Institute released a poll that went viral, generating hundreds of thousands of views. The findings reflected broader frustration within the electorate. Roughly 46.8% of respondents said they would support a Democrat congressional candidate in their district versus roughly 40% for a Republican. Nearly 50% strongly disapproved of Trump's job performance, with overall disapproval numbers reaching roughly 57%. Even more importantly, over 62% of respondents said they believed the country was heading in the wrong direction. Historically, that question is one of the clearest indicators of political momentum heading into elections. When voters believe the country is moving in the wrong direction, they typically seek some kind of change. Now, additionally, the issue rankings were equally revealing. The dominant issue by far was the economy, jobs, affordability, and cost of living. Corruption and money in politics ranked second. Immigration and border security followed behind that. Foreign policy ranked lower overall, though I personally believe many voters mentally connect foreign policy frustrations with concerns about corruption and outside influence, especially given ongoing national debate surrounding lobbying organizations like AIPAC and the recent Thomas Massie primary fight in Kentucky, and how they basically dumped tens of millions of dollars to unseat this very liked congressman. Now, all that being said, part of the reason why the poll is going viral is because it also asked respondents whether they identified as Groypers, meaning supporters of Nick Fuentes. Roughly 7.8% of respondents answered yes. Now, obviously, that is still a minority position nationally, but politically speaking, 8% is not a trivial number. In close elections, 8% can absolutely influence outcomes, shift primaries, swing districts, and shape political narratives. Yet the California Republican establishment consciously chose to ostracize and alienate those voters rather than attempt to politically integrate or persuade them. That reveals a deeper problem inside the consultant mindset here in California. Their priority is often ideological policing and social gatekeeping rather than coalition building and electoral victory. Now, I've personally been accused of being a Groyper countless times by people within the party infrastructure, and I've repeatedly said that I'm not. First, I'm too old. I'm 41 years old. While I may not identify as a Groyper, I openly support the young folks, the young patriots involved with that movement. But the broader point here is that this label has increasingly been weaponized inside Republican politics as a litmus test to derail campaigns and ostracize candidates. And frankly, it's completely detached from reality. Most people identifying with that Groyper label are younger voters, generally under 30, who are deeply online and highly engaged with internet political culture. It's truly bizarre that the Republican Party in California would decide to wage war against a segment of young activists and voters at a time when the party is already struggling demographically. Again, if we simply extrapolated that 8% figure nationally, you're talking about tens of millions of people, roughly 23 million Americans. Now, obviously, in the broader electorate, it's still a minority, but it's a politically meaningful minority. In close elections, 8% is absolutely enough to flip seats, to influence primaries, and shape the direction of a movement. And yet the California Republican Party consciously chose to push those folks away. That tells you everything you need to know about the mindset of the consultant class running the CAGOP. They are more committed to gatekeeping and ideological policing to guard their dollar than they are to actually winning elections. And honestly, we see similar dynamics elsewhere. I've seen Zionists attempt to ostracize Catholics inside the Republican Party in almost the exact same way. And I can speak from experience because I'm Catholic and I've experienced this within the party. I've been accused of being an anti-Semite purely by virtue of being a Catholic, excluding the fact that I'm critical of the Israeli government. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because I was literally just told by a Zionist within the party infrastructure that because I'm Catholic, my loyalty lies more with the Vatican than the United States, than my country, which is deeply ironic because that's essentially the exact same anti-Catholic smear pushed by the know-nothings over a century ago. The same accusation that Catholics supposedly held dual loyalties to foreign interests over America. And ironically, some of the very people, the Zionists pushing that rhetoric today, are simultaneously demanding endless financial and military support for the Israeli government. When was the last time Catholics were demanding the United States send billions to the Vatican? Never. It doesn't happen. Now, do I personally derive my morality from Christ and the teachings of the church rather than from politicians? Of course I do. But do I support the president and trust the office of the presidency? Yes. That's why I voted for him. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Now, look, you could argue that the New Yorker article and some of the polling data we just looked at are edge cases. You could say they don't fully represent the electorate or that the methodology is flawed, exaggerated, or selectively sampled. Fine, but guess what? There's more. There's always more. Because according to an alleged leak from a nonprofit reportedly working with the White House to combat so-called anti-Semitism, a separate internal survey of the dissident right revealed many of the exact same trends we've been discussing throughout this entire video. The survey described a fractured movement, weak leadership consolidation, and widespread skepticism toward Israel that cuts across religious identity and influencer trust. According to the leaked findings, 68% of respondents believed that MAGA and America First now represent different things politically. About 32% said that MAGA and America First are now distinct movements and that America First should ultimately separate from the Republican Party entirely. The survey also found that respondents largely rejected the idea that J.D. Vance represents a new generation of populist conservative leadership. One of the more notable findings was that 94% of self-identified supporters of Nick Fuentes wanted to break away from the GOP entirely. Demographically, roughly 90% of respondents were under the age of 35 and 96% were men, which again reinforces the exact point I've been making throughout this entire discussion. The Republican establishment is actively alienating younger activists and younger conservative voters rather than attempting to integrate them into a broader coalition. And by the way, the influencer trust numbers were also revealing. About 59% of respondents said they trusted Tucker Carlson compared to roughly 47% among the broader respondent pool. Around 40% trusted Candace Owens compared to roughly 30% among general respondents. But perhaps the most striking finding was that skepticism toward Israel appeared almost universal across ideological and influencer divides. The study reportedly found that trust in influencers had very little impact on respondents' feelings toward Israel. Among people who trusted Tucker, Nick, or Candace, between 86% and 93% believed Israel has too much power and influence. Even among respondents who rejected all three influencers entirely, roughly 73% still believed Israel has too much influence. The survey also found that support for Christian values had virtually no correlation with support for Israel. In other words, respondents who strongly supported Christian values in public life showed almost identical levels of skepticism toward Israel as respondents who did not. Needless to say, this completely undermines the narrative that has been pushed for years, attempting to portray Christians, particularly Catholics, as inherently anti-Semitic if they criticize Israel purely by virtue of their belief in Christ. Or even the idea that evangelicals and Protestants are automatically required to support Zionism because of dispensationalist theory or other religious frameworks built into their specific interpretation of Christianity. By the way, the data goes even further. Roughly 65% of respondents who supported Christian values in the public sphere believed America First should distance itself from the Republican Party entirely, while even among respondents who did not prioritize Christian values publicly, roughly 36% still believed there should be a split. Now, obviously, anybody with even a basic understanding of polling or online political culture should approach these alleged leaks like this cautiously. This report was posted by Gabby Cuccia on X, and like anything else online, people can debate methodology, authenticity, framing, and interpretation. This is always up for discussion, but for me, the most interesting part is not even the Israel-related findings. The most important and alarming trend is the sheer number of younger conservatives who increasingly want to break away from the Republican Party entirely. Because as a Republican, I've been warning my party about this for a long time. I've repeatedly said the strategy of ideological purges, of litmus tests, of purity tests, and endless gatekeeping is dangerous. In fact, I had this exact discussion at AmFest with E.L. Jacoby and Elizabeth Barcohana. Elizabeth, if you'll remember, was somebody who was trying to purge me from the party. As I discussed a few months ago, she was actively circulating hit pieces against me and labeling me an anti-Semite simply because I criticized Israel and argued that younger America First activists and Groypers should remain inside the Republican coalition rather than be exiled from it. During that debate at AmFest, both she and E.L. Jacoby were so aggressively Israel-focused that they openly argued Groypers and similar factions needed to be completely purged from the GOP. And I openly disagreed. I said directly that I believed the smarter approach was to keep these younger activists inside the coalition, work with them where possible, and prevent a future fracture on the right. We need to win the midterms. That's literally what I said. And needless to say, for that position alone, I've been smeared by Elizabeth and her cohorts here in Los Angeles as an anti-Semite. I've been smeared as a white supremacist and constantly pressured to answer for statements I never personally made and views that I do not personally hold. That's what ideological puritists do, folks. They create guilt by association, they create fragmentation, and eventually they create generational collapse, which is what we're once again witnessing inside the GOP. That's how you end up with large numbers of younger conservatives and Republicans who no longer feel like the Republican Party even wants them here. And look, just putting it bluntly, let me be candid with you for a second. That's because many of these consultant class operatives like Elizabeth Barcohana are not experts at coalition building. They're experts at losing. They're experts at preserving donor networks, preserving consultant contracts, preserving the very little influence they have, and keeping the grift running indefinitely so they can stuff their pockets and pay their bills. They don't know how to actually build a durable populist coalition capable of winning this state. In many ways, some of these people seem openly hostile to traditional American values themselves. Take Elizabeth, for example. She was openly cheering for escalation with Iran and demanding blood online. This is a person who supposedly supported President Trump, the same guy who ran on No New Wars, the same guy who stood on stage next to Jeb Bush and criticized his brother for getting us entangled in Afghanistan and Iraq. And look, just putting it bluntly, once again, we're doing a lot of things bluntly today. I think there's something deeply pathological about people who comfortably sit on X, on their couch, calling for wars they themselves will likely never have to fight in. She is never going to get drafted. She is never going to be sent overseas into combat. Yet, here she is, comfortably posting on X from her couch about how America should launch a ground invasion into Iran and mocking men who oppose escalation and call for peaceful resolution with minimal casualties as betas or pussies. Listen, Elizabeth, how about you go bench 2 plates before lecturing anyone about masculinity? Better yet, how about you have your bald 5'8" husband do it for you? And the self-owns continue, folks, because these people are so unbelievably insufferable and so objectively incompetent that they cannot help but self-destruct if you simply allow enough time for reality to catch up to them. The same people running around demanding ideological purges inside the Republican Party continue exposing themselves through their own hypocrisy because, as I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth Barcohana was one of the loudest voices pushing to purge America First people from the party. And the CAGOP itself was openly attempting to isolate and ostracize America First candidates and activists. Yet at the same time, these same people endorsed a candidate named Keith Cascio, who, according to Rob Pyers on X, was among the small number of donors supporting Tony Thurmond in his gubernatorial efforts. Yes, Tony Thurmond, the Democrat. Think about that for a second, folks. A candidate endorsed by the California Republican Party and promoted by the same people screaming about ideological purity and purging actual conservatives from the Republican Party were simultaneously supporting a candidate who was financially supporting a Democrat. And yet somehow America First candidates were treated as a real threat to the Republican Party. Who could have seen that one coming? Now, what makes this even more absurd is that I personally met Keith Cascio, and in my experience, the guy barely aligns with Republican principles at all. He's pro-abortion, he's pro-reparations, he's pro-gay marriage, he's pro-mass immigration. On issue after issue, this guy aligns more closely with some far-left positions than any traditional Republican ones. Yet somehow, this is the candidate receiving institutional support and endorsements from so-called trusted figures in the party, while actual grassroots conservatives are treated like enemies to be removed. And that tells you everything you need to know about what is really happening here. This is not about protecting conservative values. This is not about preserving the integrity of the Republican Party. This is about a consultant grift, preserving this consultant grift. They would rather back controlled, manageable, ideologically weak candidates, even candidates who align with Democrats on major issues, than allow actual populist conservatives who can win elections to gain influence inside the party apparatus. And here's how I know this entire strategy is fundamentally disconnected from reality. Just the other day, folks, I was out door knocking. Crazy concept, right? Actually doing the job of a candidate, actually going out into neighborhoods and speaking to voters directly, which frankly is more than I can say for a lot of these consultant class political operatives and social media personalities who spend all day lecturing conservatives online while never actually interacting with ordinary voters in their districts. See, I was walking neighborhoods, talking to residents, introducing myself, as I've been doing every single day of this campaign. I've been listening to their concerns, and over again, I heard the same thing. You're the first Republican candidate to knock on my door in years. Some people told me I was the first Republican candidate to ever knock on their door. Now, that should terrify the Republican establishment in California, but instead, these people spend their time obsessing over ideological purity tests and Twitter drama instead of actually going out and trying to hear what voters want. Now, one interaction in particular really stuck with me. I met an older couple on Sunday afternoon while they were returning home from church. The older gentleman told me he had just come back from the Syriac church. They were very conservative. He said to me, "I'm a Republican, but I stopped supporting the party years ago." And I asked him why. And he looked at me and said, "Because the Republican Party is not what it used to be. Do you understand what I'm saying?" And I told him, "Yes, sir, I absolutely do." And then he said something that honestly summarizes the entire problem better than most consultants or political strategists ever could. He said, "The Republican Party no longer stands for Christian principles." And I responded and said, "Yes, sir, I know exactly what you mean." Then he asked me directly, "Are you Christian?" And I reached down and pulled out my cross, which I was wearing around my neck at the time, the same cross that I have sitting right next to me right here, along with my St. Michael rosary, my 10-bead rosary, St. Michael. And I looked at him and I said, "Sir, I know exactly what you're talking about." And honestly, that was enough. Both of us understood immediately what the other meant without needing to say much more. He took my campaign card, told me he was going to donate, told me he was going to support my campaign. And that, folks, is how you actually build a coalition. That's how you actually win. If you want to call yourself a Republican, then actually be one. Stop pretending. Stop cosplaying as one. Stop talking the talk while undermining the very values and voters that built this party in the first place. Stop turning the Republican Party into a consultant-managed shell completely disconnected from its own grassroots base, its own principles, and ordinary Americans, because at the end of the day, people can tell when somebody is authentic and when somebody is fake. They can tell when a candidate actually believes something versus when they're simply performing for donors, for consultants, and political networks. And that disconnect is exactly why so many voters no longer trust the Republican establishment, especially here in California. And look, if you want to hijack the party, if you want to hollow it out, if you want to purge actual conservatives while elevating candidates who barely align with Republican values, then frankly, get the hell out. That's pretty much it. Okay, folks? I hope you enjoy this one. Spicy. Anyway, take care.